the decks for action. The decks for action, the time for speech is past, and do the job we have to do, and get it over fast. Let's put the axe to the axis, let 'em know that their show is all through. Oh, let's put the axe to the axis, lend a hand to the land we love true. With all our might, we'll fight, because we know we're right. And then, again, the future will be bright. So let's put the axe to the axis, and finish up the trouble they began. The axe to the axis, try a can to Japan and the rest. Oh, let's get real nasty to Nazis, Italy will soon see that we're best. There is no doubt about the fact we'll never stop until we will, like always, land on top. So let's put the axe to the axis and teach them not to pick on a process.
Hello, and welcome to the inaugural meeting of the Chieftain's Armored Vehicle Society, aka CAVS. I'm Cabbage Mechanic, your Senior Community Manager, just here to throw an introduction to the Chieftain and his guest, military historian Harry Yeide. I'm very excited that all of you are here tonight. We have some exciting opportunities for you to win prizes. I hope you all reviewed the book that we'll be discussing today, which is The Tank Destroyers by Mr. Yeide. And thank you to everyone saying hi in chat. It's not Godzilla, it's Blastoise. But anyway, I'm just here for a moment just to say hello, let you know what's going on. We're going to be discussing the tank killers today, and generally everything American Tank Destroyer related. We have a quiz that I will be distributing in chat. You guys will fill in the responses on the quiz, and those of you who make Chieftain's honor roll or get the best responses, by the way, some answers may come up during the discussion, so that's a hint. We'll have a chance to win some premium U.S. tank destroyers and some copies of Mr. Yeide's other books. So let's have a great evening. Let's have some great discussion, and hopefully some of you read the book and are ready to participate. Hello, there I am. I think we are. There we go. No, I'm with Mr. Yeide now. Sorry, I had the confidence monitor up. It wasn't showing everything. Sorry, everyone. Here's Mr. Yeide. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you're having a wonderful lockdown or whatever stage you are at where you are.
Yes,
we're still
indeed.
deep in it.
Great to be here.
Maybe you'd like to take a moment to introduce yourself to our audience and what you're all about.
Sure. Well, my name's Harry Yeide, and I was a government employee for 33 years working in foreign affairs. But I was always a World War II nut, particularly a tank nut, and I started writing books. After I took a walk with a friend, I'd been out to the National Archives and gone through the separate tank battalion records, and I told him, wow, there's such an amazing story to be told there. And he said, write a book. And I thought, well, why not? So that's how I got into it.
Sounds good. Having spent some time in archives myself, it's always both fun and scary. Archivists are actually the scariest people I've ever met personally. But it seems like it resulted in some great work. So let's get into it and introduce our the name giver of this society, Nicholas the Chieftain Morin.
Die Panzer gehen zum
All
Angriff
right,
vor.
no,
Das feindliche
now
Widerstandsnest
we'll
muss
get out
ausgeräuchert
of your
werden.
way and let you get into it.
Woohoo! All right, hello everybody. This is something completely new. We haven't done this before, so we are not entirely sure how this is supposed to work. So we're just going to make it up as we go along. I do have chat up, so the idea, as far as I know it, behind a book club. This isn't going to be just a book club. We're going to do movies and guns, whatever else. Oh, Melbourne! Yeah, the Australians are complete lockdown. I was talking to one soldier. He's on border patrol duty. He's in Victoria, I think it is, on border between Victoria and Western Australia, if they border. And he says there's absolutely nothing there. It's like a dirt road, but he's on border duty, stopping people from moving. Anyway, so the idea that I have in mind for this is that we're going to be starting the discussion, myself and Harry, talking about the book. It's going through the book, starting at the very beginning until we get to the end. And as you guys have comments or opinions or questions or what have you, go ahead and put them in the chat. And assuming that they're on topic, I mean, Harry is a real-world expert. Do not ask World of Tanks questions about to him because he probably will not know the answer. Tell me if I'm wrong, Harry. I presume you don't play.
No, I will not know the answer.
Okay, we can hook you up with a couple of with a special account maybe, and give you a couple of things. So anyway, Harry's probably more famous for the tank killers, I think, than for the infantry's armor. Not that it is in any way a worse book, but so I thought we'd start off with the tank killers because, as near as I can tell, with the exception of my book on their development, you, Harry, are the only person who've really done a proper, thorough book on American tank destroyers. Tell me if I'm wrong.
To my knowledge, mine is the only book besides yours, other than the original, very thin pamphlet-length book that was done by the Army War College, and nobody else has gone after it since.
So what you did infantry's armor, then you have a think about it. You say, "Well, gee, that was tough," and then you decide you're going to do the tank killers. How? Why?
Okay, so my first book was actually called Steel Victory, which I redid as the infantry's armor because my first book was very much a first book. I learned a lot. It was imperfect, and it did not adequately cover the subject. It was just on separate tank battalions in the European theater. So when I went back later and did the infantry's armor, I covered all of the theaters of war, which was the right way to do it, including the amphibian, tank, and tractor battalions, which are part of the armored force. But while I was doing the work on the tank battalions, I kept seeing their interaction with tank destroyers. And even though I had read a lot of military history, I didn't know a whole lot about the tank destroyers. And one day, one of the offices at work was moving, and a buddy of mine found behind a safe a copy of this Army booklet on the tank destroyer force and gave it to me. And I read it, and I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. And my bet is that the records of the tank destroyer units have just as many fantastic, interesting stories as the separate tank battalions. So that's why I went after it. And that turned out to be true. And I have to say that the stories are parallel in a lot of ways, but the huge distinction I would draw between the tank battalions and tank destroyer battalions is that you never see, or hardly ever see, tank crews going out and trying to find enemy tanks. You know, if they showed up, you dealt with it. You see tank destroyer man going out trying to find the enemy and kill him. It's just a different philosophy about the doctrine and the way they were taught to fight the war.
So when you decide that you're going to come up, so I had this problem when I started my book. It's kind of like there has to be the first thing you sit down and type, or yeah, okay. So you sit down for a computer, the first words that you type for this new book. Where do you start?
Wow, I don't remember exactly what my first words in the book are. Do you have a copy there?
Well, the first, Cameron is saying that he loves the first sentence of your book.
Oh, no. Well, so...
Tank destroyer force in World War II must rate as one of the most successful failures in American military history.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's a good... Yeah, that's really punchy. I like that. That's good. And it's true because... you know, the Army went to great lengths to create the tank destroyer force, but then at the end of the war, oh, hey, we've got a visitor.
Okay, Mama has arrived to remove him. Anyway, continue on.
Yeah, by the end of the war, the Army decided that tank destroyers were a thoroughly redundant concept, and by November 1946, there was not a single tank destroyer unit left in the Army. And I have to say, by that time, it made sense. You know, if we want to, can we sort of set the stage by pulling up and rolling what the psychological atmosphere was? I know PowerPoint.
Okay, we can do that. We can bring up the PowerPoint, but I'm still kind of curious. I mean, you have to go in the archives. I mean, did you attack this with a plan, or did you just start digging and seeing what came up?
Well, yes. I mean, I had the Army pamphlet, which provided me with a general picture of what I was going to be looking at, but it didn't provide any sense of the tactical level action. Exactly how the men experienced the war, the things they learned, the things they didn't learn and died because of it, the mistakes the Army made, all the nitty-gritty detail that is the life's blood of popular military history. None of that was there. So I could go into it knowing roughly in this year things started to happen, there were maneuvers and so on and so forth. But that's not what really interests me. What interests me is the story of the men who fought the war. And all of the rest is just the packaging. And so to get into that, it wasn't just a case of going to the archives. I was able still, when I wrote this book, to track down a surprising number of veterans. And a surprising number of them still had crisp, clear memories. There was one veteran, for example, from the 701st Tank Destroyer Battalion, who told me details, and I'd go to the unit journal, and I could see exactly what he was talking about happening, and sometimes what he told me about the backstory explained it. I also used combat interviews and so forth. So yeah, it was a pretty broad sweep. And what I do, because you never know what you're going to find in personal accounts like that, is I write as I find stuff. I have a pretty good idea where it's going to fit in, but I don't, like a lot of authors, will take notes and then go back and carefully construct their product. I write as I see things that are interesting.
All right. Well, let's bring up that PowerPoint then. Hopefully, I probably need to have a look and see what the output is on the Twitch or YouTube or wherever it is that this is. But let's go back to, I guess, 1936, give or take, and the anti-tank defense document. I think that's a good start point.
Sure. Let's roll to the next slide first, and run the video here, because this is a psychological context for everything I'm going to be talking about.
Die Panzer gehen zum Angriff vor. Das feindliche Widerstandsnest muss ausgeräuchert werden.
I have no idea if that's rolling or not. So
it is rolling. I don't think we have sound, but this is footage from the Blitzkrieg in Poland, and between the wars, the U.S. Army had shrunk to 200,000 men. Most of its tank inventory was from the First World War, and they see newsreel footage like this coming out of Europe, and there's a deep sense of foreboding. They are not prepared to fight a war against an enemy like this. So now we can go to the next slide. Sorry.
The next one or the previous one?
Yeah. No,
this next one, the tank destroyer story.
This is a summary, and this is a good place to start. So the most interesting things in the big picture about the tank destroyers was that it was not an attempt to refight the last war. They saw mechanized blitzkrieg. They'd never faced mechanized blitzkrieg before, so it was blue sky time. They had to dream up a doctrine to handle what, by the time they started actually formulating tank destroyer doctrine, they knew was going to have to deal with an army that had crushed Poland and was in the process of crushing France. And the French army was seen as the best army in Europe. It was stunning. And all they knew is that everything the French had done, all of the tanks they had, all of the advanced equipment, it hadn't worked. They were getting crushed. So they did create a creative new doctrine. The doctrine turned out, in retrospect, to kind of suck. It didn't really apply very well to what the real world was going to hand them on the battlefield. But the plus side was that American soldiers are ingenious people. And here they had these useful weapons that were being delivered to them by Uncle Sam. And they figured out ways to use tank destroyers that made them incredibly useful on the battlefield. But then, getting back to that first sentence in the book, by the end of the war, the Army decided you didn't need these things anymore. The concept was flawed, and tanks could do the job. So, next slide.
Hold on, Foxfire. When we get there, we're not going to this isn't just going to purely be a PowerPoint thing. But when we do get there, ask your question again, because it is a fair question. Foxglove, you mentioned the anti-tank rock. I don't know if you saw that article I put out, Harry, where I went about how the U.S. Army was trying to stop tanks with rifles and rocks. It was kind of like nothing we have is really officially good to stop a tank. So what happens if we take a rifle or a BAR and we shove it into the tank tracks?
Well, times of desperation, right?
Well, that's what it was. And the report stated that the light tank M2 was a very efficient mangler of rifle barrels. And so then they took a rock and they tried to detract the tank with a rock, and the rock did not survive. But they photographed and then classified the photograph of the rock.
Oh my goodness!
Which was awesome.
Well, so and by comparison to that, the junk that they had in the arsenal in 1936. Looks pretty good, right? That's bigger than a rock. It's a lousy tank with nothing but machine guns on it, and we built 16 of the things in 1936. And in 1936, despite the fact that everybody knew the Europeans were building tank forces, the U.S. Army had no doctrine for dealing with them. So in 1936, you get the very first attempt at doctrine, a manual that was called Anti-Tank Defense Tentative. So it's not even real doctrine yet, and it relies on just having a whole bunch of anti-tank guns, basically, in infantry divisions. Small problem was that the United States was not producing any anti-tank guns. Next slide, please. So we jump ahead to 1939. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see that despite the fact that 3 years have passed, the U.S. Army does not have an anti-tank gun in production. I mean, it's incredible. We produce 15 tanks armed with a 37 millimeter main gun. So we're at least now able to produce a gun of 37 millimeter caliber. And they update the pseudo doctrine or the proto doctrine to something that actually makes sense in a World War I context. An anti-tank defense in depth, which the Germans used against us in the Meuse-Argonne, motorized divisional anti-tank battalions with robust recon capability, so they can mass against armored attacks. And this, at least, is the core concept that transferred over to the tank destroyer force. Mobile with robust reconnaissance and the idea that you're going to mass against armored attacks. However, keep in mind that video. That's what the Army is thinking about in terms of armored attacks. They think it's going to be a whole bunch of tanks. They actually believe most of them will be light tanks, and they're not accompanied by infantry. They're not accompanied by armor. They don't have close air support. It's just a whole bunch of tanks steaming your way. Okay, so next slide, please. So in 1940, France is being overrun, and only then does the Army create an armored force. And tank destroyers are not part of the armored force. The armored force is not actually interested in tank destroyers. It's only interested in tanks. And the infantry and the artillery branches start fighting over who ought to be responsible for anti-tank defense. Our cutting-edge tank is now the M3 light tank with a 37 millimeter gun. On the right, you can see the Germans are already putting 50 millimeter guns on their battle tanks. So we're way behind, and they can take a 75 millimeter gun. So what are you going to do about that? We don't even have a tank that can face these Germans. Next slide, please. So two people had a great deal of influence over the tank destroyer force intellectually, and in terms of shaping how the U.S. Army created and trained the units. One was Leslie McNair, and he was an artillery officer. And McNair believed that it was a waste of good government resources for tanks to fight tanks. Tanks ought to spend their time breaking into the German rear and raising heck, and anti-tank guns ought to deal with those waves of German armor coming at our infantrymen. He thought that highly mobile anti-tank units should be created. So he wasn't thinking just about static anti-tank guns. And that concept would come back in the course of the maneuvers as the Army got itself organized. Next, please. So things started to come together for the tank destroyer force specifically when in May, Marshall established a planning branch for anti-tank warfare under Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce. And Bruce was personally a very forceful guy. I mean, people talk about how whenever he talked about anti-tank warfare, he'd say, we're gonna strike him, we're gonna strike him. And he's always beating his fist into his hand. And he also decided to end the infantry artillery fight over who was going to control anti-tank defense by creating a separate, what became Tank Destroyer Command. Next slide, please. So the Army started its first major maneuvers in June in Tennessee. And by then, the 1st and 2nd Armored Divisions had formed. They grew out of the two prototype mechanized brigades that the Army had, one controlled by the infantry and the other controlled by the cavalry branch. And during those maneuvers, Patton basically ran over everybody with the 2nd Armored Division. But the defenders had essentially no anti-tank defenses. So this is, in U.S. maneuver form, sort of the nightmare of going to war against the Germans. But it took Hitler invading the Soviet Union with a vast mechanized force before the Army established anti-tank battalions at all. And the battalions had, they were small. They used the artillery on hand, which was 37 millimeter, 75 millimeter field artillery. And there were all of 8 battalions in the Army. So next slide, please. So getting back to General McNair, he wasn't really very happy about the way the first maneuvers had turned out. So he set up a new set of rules for the next set of maneuvers. And he wrote the rules so that anti-tank guns were extremely powerful, and he created this force of highly mobile anti-tank units to take on the armor. They were 3 regiment-sized units. Next slide, please. Actually, can we go back to the previous slide? Because the Chieftain and I talked about the references to mounting a 37 millimeter gun in a half track. And this is one from the maneuvers. You know, they had no equipment to implement the doctrine they were formulating. So that's the stage they were at. So next slide. So Marshall thought about these anti-tank groups, and he thought that didn't sound threatening enough. And when he finally activated the units that people were thinking about, he called them Tank Destroyer Battalion. And shortly thereafter, one of these groups that McNair had created in the next maneuvers in November allegedly destroyed an entire armored regiment by approaching them with speed, surrounding them, and shooting them up. And this gave the proponents of mobile anti-tank warfare the sense that they were absolutely right. The maneuvers, though, taught the armored force some important lessons. You know, they'd been facing McNair's rules that made anti-tank guns extremely lethal against them, which was true. It was going to be true in the real world. And the lesson they learned was they had to have infantry. And the armor force reorganized armored divisions and provided a big chunk of armored infantry. So they learned something. But the anti-tank force presses ahead along these lines. And that is a prototype M3 tank destroyer.
T-12.
The first tank destroyer force was actually founded at Fort Meade, Maryland, where NSA is now. So we have lost our video. Well, to carry on, the tank destroyer command is actually organized in May of 1941, and I was thinking that, you know, in a way, this was kind of a COVID-19 moment for the U.S. Army. It was this awful threat that nobody knew how to fix, and their timeline wasn't all that much different from people desperately trying to create a vaccine. So, you know, they start experimenting. Now that we're back, can we go to the next slide? I'd like to. Okay, let's roll forward. Okay, so their doctrine was summarized as seek, strike, and destroy. Very aggressive, using the approach that the mobile anti-tank unit had used, going out, seeking the enemy, and destroying his tanks. And Bruce's conception is that you'll have fast, lightly armored tank destroyers that will seek out the enemy, ambush them, maneuver constantly, exploit superior observation, and all tank destroyers are going to be built with no top cover. Even the tracked units have open top turrets, strong firepower, and they're to avoid slugging matches. And your M3 tank destroyer at the time kind of answers that strong firepower in the context of what's out there in the world. It's as big a gun as anything on a German tank. It's fast and light. So you can imagine that, given the constraints of American defense industry, having to make do with what they had, it didn't seem madness. We'll see what they picked for the light tank destroyer, which was madness. Anyway, next slide, please. So here's the doctrine in pictures. Do not do what's on the left. Do not get in the way and have a slugging match. Do what's on the right. Flank the enemy and fire on his flanks. And the doctrine imagines you're going to have an entire tank destroyer battalion held in reserve, despite the fact that there's a raging battle going on. And even though there is absolutely nothing in the doctrine that tells you how to interact with the infantry or armor or artillery or close air support, somehow you're going to know exactly when that tank destroyer battalion is supposed to rush in and crush the enemy armor. Next slide, please. I like this slide because it shows the enemy tanks rolling to the top of the screen, and the tank destroyers are deployed on high ground to the right. And this is actually essentially what happens in the Battle of El Guitar. So it is an actual piece of doctrine that wound up being in the real world. So just so we don't dismiss the doctrine entirely, there's a page that made it. Okay, next one, please. So again, this was pretty creative thinking. It was innovative. They were trying to do it different. Tank destroyers would be self-propelled. And Leslie McNair lost that battle. Bruce won that battle. They were going to be self-propelled. They would cost a lot less than a tank. They would be lighter than a tank, so they could go places that tanks couldn't go. And Bruce wanted his tank destroyer men to be an elite force, so he put them all through commando training. And the idea was that when their tank destroyer was knocked out, they were going to dismount, and using improvised explosives, or maybe a bazooka, they were going to go out on foot and hunt down enemy tanks and destroy them. That never happened in battle, as far as I can tell. Some guys took bazookas out and killed tanks, but that's about it. Okay, so next slide, please. So looking back on it, and you have to agree that there were certain problems. Again, it had no concept of combined arms. It was unrealistic in believing that tank destroyers would not be committed to battle when they were around to be committed to battle. And despite the offensive spirit of bang, bang, we're going to attack them, hit them hard, seek, strike, destroy, it assumed that you were going to be on the defensive against that mass of German tanks rolling toward you. And in point of fact, while that happened in several battles, the majority of the war, the Americans were on the offensive. And the doctrine had nothing to say about how you could profitably use tank destroyers when you were attacking the other guys who were in the position of stopping your tanks heading towards them in a horde. Okay, next slide, please. So they knew their equipment wasn't great. The M3, the gun could traverse only 21 degrees. If you fired it at a greater angle, it was likely to tip over. It turned very slowly, And because the gun had a limited traverse, you had to sight primarily by moving the vehicle. But it was pretty fast. And again, it had a big gun for the time. Next slide, please. Bad idea. Bad idea. The M6 TD is a Dodge truck with a 37 millimeter gun on top. The only protection is that 1/4-inch steel splash shield. It can't fire forward over the cab because it will shatter the windshield, and the crew is exposed under fire. It's a terrible idea. And by the time the tank destroyers get to North Africa, the British have already learned that the 37 millimeter is not a very good anti-tank gun. It's just not up to the job. The reconnaissance company, again, I said robust reconnaissance made it all the way through. A tank destroyer battalion, in fact, had 3 line companies. Initially, 2 were heavy with the M3 half-track, and 1 was light with the M6. It had a reconnaissance company, and it had an engineer platoon, which was extremely useful because you needed to be able to prepare firing positions for your tank destroyers. The reconnaissance company was initially equipped with what the armored force called peeps. So, they'd be out in front of everybody else with nothing but air between them and the enemy, and a 30 cal mounted in the back. They were some very brave men. Next slide, please. All right, let's roll the video here. This is Army propaganda. We've got the Germans' number. Still no sound. Well, okay, so this, huh?
We can live with that sound.
Yeah. So this is no, we're back to the Blitzkrieg. Never mind. Let's go past this slide.
Okay, Harry. Let's take a break here for a second in the progress. Sure. We'll kind of discuss now what we've gone over about the formation of the TD branch and its doctrine. Now, again, I don't know if you read it, but I did an article about the German development of tank destroyer doctrine. And if you read it in 1930s, what the Germans were talking about, you'll see that it's exactly the same as what the Americans were coming up with as well. So it's kind of like these will be light-skinned, open-top vehicles that will have the advantage of vision against their enemies. And the only difference was that where the US talked in battalions with occasionally companies, the Germans were talking about companies with occasionally platoons, but otherwise it was actually very similar. There was a couple of questions here. First was, how long did it take to develop a new weapon system in the TD branch? So I was doing some quick digging in my own book, and it looks like the TDs were much, much faster. The M3 was only a couple of months. The M10 was only a couple of months, but again, this is based off of stuff that already exists. The M18 took longer. And another question is, do you think that the M3, would it be fair to say that the M3 didn't do as well as expected, but did better than it should?
Well, yeah, I think that's fair. It did much better than expected, and it proved lethal. We'll talk about this when we look at operations in North Africa, and it also, because it had a field gun mounted on it, it opened the door to a whole new non-doctrinal role for the tank destroyer force, which was indirect fire as artillery. But there's no question it had thin armor that would stop absolutely nothing but even a machine gun bullet. A soldier was asked whether rounds from German aircraft went all the way through the half track, and the answer was, no, sir, it just punches through one wall and then it rattles around inside.
That was in the movies.
Yeah, it was dangerous to fight in, and again, these were very, very brave men who fought in it.
The other thing about the M3 is it didn't have a semi-automatic breech block. Is that a lot of people don't realize that?
Oh no!
It literally was a Model 1897 gun.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those things of people say, oh, the American doctrine said tanks don't fight tanks, tank destroyers fight tanks. Well, the tanks had as good as, if not better, guns than the TDs.
Not at this point in the war.
Well, it did. But the M3 Grant shows up, and they're fighting next to the M3 gun motor carriage. Both have 75s, except the Grant's one is a semi-auto.
Okay.
Now, there's a bit of a delay with the 76 to the 3-inch.
But when the tank destroyer is fielded, the M3 Grant isn't deployable yet. So it's the best they have at the time. The only standardized tank is the M3 light tank at that point.
So, do you think, given what was known at the time, do you think they should have come up with a different doctrine? You went over why they came up with it, and it did make sense. But do you think using the same information, you could have come up with something, or anybody could have come up with something better?
No, I never second guess people who are sitting in that situation, trying to do their best against an unknown threat. No. I know that you can find clear examples of military mistakes, but their thought process was logical, and they didn't have that much to work with. They had to work with the equipment that the Army had, and there wasn't even much of that.
Yeah,
I'm just curious though about the German development. Why did they abandon that approach? Because essentially what happens in the German Army is that the assault gun, which is part of the field artillery up until halfway through the war, becomes their main mobile anti-tank defense.
Well, if you have a look, the doctrine was being developed before they had actually made any tank destroyers at all. The first time that they actually did make tank destroyers, you're talking about the Panzerjäger 1, which is that basically it's a Panzer 1 with an open top and a 47mm gun. And as I'm pulling up the document, fast tank destroyers are unique in their continual readiness to fire, high cross-country mobility and armor protection. They are qualified to combat enemy tanks by attacking. Unhindered observation with an open top allows early recognition and engagement of enemy tanks, which have limited vision. When attacking field or fixed fortifications, the vehicles can be used to fire a bunker opening. On the defense, they are held in reserve. They will not be sent into action until the direction of the enemy tank attack is clearly identified. Their task is to destroy the enemy tanks that have penetrated. So that's what the Panzerjäger manual said, translated into English. And when I wrote this in the article, I just put quotes, and I don't say when I am changing from the German manual to the American manual because it is so seamless and identical.
So do you know whether that was ever used in combat?
I see no reason it was not.
I've just never seen one in a picture.
But I think it's the same. It's the same reason. So when the Panzerjäger 1 was in service, what were the Germans doing? They were attacking.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same problem that the Americans would end up having.
That's pretty funny. Good insight, Chieftain. Thank you.
So I'll send you the link to that article as well after we're done here.
Okay.
So it's in defense of German assault guns became to the it is true that when you get to the Jagdpanzers, the Germans started losing the plot a little bit to have slugging matches. But I suspect that may also have been a factor of the fact that they simply didn't have the resources to have entire battalions of units just sitting around in the rear doing nothing.
Right.
Okay, so let's go back to your slides. Let's go into North Africa, and we'll cover North Africa.
And the main reason for the slides is pictures. So let me summarize the North Africa operation. Operation Torch on the 8th, 8 November 1942. 2 tank destroyer battalions participated in the operation landings at Iran. The 701st was attached to the 1st Armored Division, and the 601st Reconnaissance Company only at this point went in as a 2nd Corps asset. The 1st Armored Division, the Americans landing at Oran, well, actually all the landing sites, they didn't have modern landing craft yet. So the way they had to put armored vehicles ashore was they used what they called Maracaibo vessels, which were converted oil tankers from the Venezuelan oil trade. And to get the vehicles to shore, you had to lay a pontoon bridge and drive them off. So the 1st Armored Division only landed its light tanks in the very first phase of the operation, as plus the tank destroyers. The division, one of the combat commands, Combat Command B, engaged in a classic double envelopment of Oran and sent 2 flying columns around the sides of the city to meet up on the far side. And each of these flying columns led with the tank destroyer, a company of tank destroyers at the point, which had nothing whatsoever to do with doctrine. Nobody had ever exercised this. But again, you look back on the context of people making decisions, the only tanks they have are M3 light tanks with 37 millimeter guns. So even in the U.S. Army on that battlefield on that day, the tank destroyer is king. So the tank destroyers led both of the flying columns, and they were the first American units around Oran to engage the French. The first tanks they actually killed, that happened on the 9th of November, the next day, when they shredded a bunch of small French Renault AMC 35s. Anyway, their main job initially was essentially, finding the enemy and pinning him down. So nothing to do with tank destroyer doctrine. Once Oran was captured, the front moves rapidly east to Tunisia. Let's. I think I've got a couple of pictures here that might.
Yes, slide. You didn't say slide forward.
Next slide. So here we have a picture of an M3 actually firing its gun in Tunisia, and I've already talked about that stuff. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's just detail. That's what happened. Next slide, please. Here are the poor French tanks. And somebody commented that they really felt sorry for the French because the 75 millimeter rounds just blew through them like paper. And it was a very sad thing, firing on people that you viewed as your friends. Next slide, please. So this is a map of Tunisia. And every highlighted spot there is a place where 1 battalion of tank destroyers were initially distributed. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion eventually lands and also comes out. The tank destroyers are the only armored vehicles with a 75 millimeter gun that can drive all the way, and the rickety railroad will not sustain a flow of armored vehicles yet to the front. So the tank destroyers drive 1,000 miles under their own power to deploy at the front. Some of them deploy with the British in the north, and others deploy with a task force in the south, commanded by a Colonel Raff, who had some paratroopers that were dropped in to capture an airfield at Tafaraoui, I think it was called. And the Germans, meanwhile, are landing forces in Tunisia. And their first pushback with armor is in the south. And the only reason that RAF is able to hold off the Axis armor and turn it back is because he's able to run the tank destroyers from town to town down there in the south and engage the enemy armor and drive it off, all with tank destroyers. And if he hadn't had them, his task force would have been simply overrun by enemy armor. Up in the north with the British, it's a similar picture, though they were never at risk of being overrun the way the Southern Task Force was. So next slide, please. That's not a very good picture, but that's an M3 rolling through dust in the Tunisian desert. Next slide, please. We've talked about that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, that was a crew compartment in an M3. So that's the visual of what it was like to be looking over nothing but a flash screen at an enemy who was actually inside a tank. Okay, so everybody's probably heard of the Battle of Kasserine. This picture is of destroyed tank destroyers in the actual pass at Kasserine. And this should have been the big test of the tank destroyer force, because by now you have 4 tank destroyer battalions out with the Allied armies in Tunisia. And the Germans launch a major armored counterattack against the American front. And it should have been the case that you'd have the tank destroyer battalions rushing to confront the enemy. But they had been parceled out, as I indicated with that earlier map, in company-sized packets all across the front. And as they engaged in their small numbers, they were simply swept aside with everybody else. It was a rout. The 1st Armored Division officially conceded in its records that it had been defeated in detail. So, obviously in the end, the American line stabilized. Everything went back to normal, in part because Rommel had to turn back to deal with Montgomery's army on the east. But this appeared to be a great failure of the tank destroyer concept. Next slide, please. So the test that I referred to on that doctrinal page occurred on the 23rd of March at El Ghatar, when the 10th Panzer Division attacked the 1st Infantry Division. And it was a learning experience on both sides, really, because the commander of the 10th Panzer Division, I looked into his history when writing Fighting Patton. He'd spent all his time on the Eastern Front up till now. And against the Soviets, attacking uphill generally worked out pretty well with a mixed, a combined arms force. So he thought he could do that against an American infantry division, which was much bigger, more robust, had a heck of a lot of artillery, and had strung along the high ground the entire 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion. And the tank destroyers did exactly what they'd been trained to do. They would go over the rise, they would fire, they would pull back, they would move to a new firing position, and fire again. There was also the 1st Tank Destroyer Battalion equipped with the new M10 in reserve. And as per doctrine, it moved forward to engage the enemy force and did so on the flat battlefield down below the high ground. The 601st was almost decimated in the exchange. It killed more tanks than it lost tank destroyers, but its vehicle casualty rate was about 80%. The M10s claimed 15 kills for the loss of 5 M10s, and the 10th Panzer Division was beaten off. So here you had the doctrine working out perfectly.
I love how that map doesn't say German or enemy; it says Nazi arty and Nazi tanks.
Yeah, well, this is actually a period map.
Oh yeah.
So what can you say? They were Nazis. Okay, so anyway, do you want to take another break? The end of the North Africa campaign rolls around, of course, in March of the next year.
Yeah, you got a couple more slides before we take the next break. So
okay. Well, let's see.
Yeah, keep going. I'll hold you.
All right. Next slide, please. Well, here's a photo actually from the American position of the 10th Panzer Division attacking. So that's the visual scene that the tank destroyer crews would have. Next slide, please. And this is going to be the tank destroyers on the high ground. You can see their hull defilade. They'd poke over the top and zoom back down. The vehicle in the foreground is part of their reconnaissance company. So next slide, please. And there's the an M10 from the 899th coming up to the front. So as the chief said, it was easy relatively to get the M10 set up because it used the M4 chassis. It just had thinner armor and the open top turret. And I have to say that out of all the tank destroyers, the most loyal tank destroyer units in terms of the equipment they loved, it was the M10. The units that served with the M10 loved it. Okay, what do we have next then on slide-wise? Oh, hey, we've got video of an M10 firing. I like film of weapons firing.
Oh, the sound is actually coming through on YouTube. You just can't hear it on our end.
Oh, okay. So that's a heck of a muzzle blast, isn't it?
Well, at least it doesn't have a muzzle blast deflector, making even more.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it was a real problem with spotting rounds. All right, we've probably seen enough M10 footage. It's just the ideas. So anyway, as I said, the theory worked for once, but that was the end of the M3, the Purple Heart box, and the Army would go to war in Italy with the M10.
Next slide.
So here's the most dire thing that came out of North Africa. The Germans had effectively used 88 millimeter anti-tank guns, well, anti-aircraft guns as anti-tank guns. They were extremely lethal. They could be fairly well hidden even in the desert. And the geniuses in the American command thought, they did such a good job in North Africa that we need towed tank destroyer battalion. And this was a case of the Army bureaucracy fighting the last campaign. So the Army ordered 50% of all tank battalions to convert to towed guns. And they had a towed 3-inch gun. The picture there is one of the prototypes at Aberdeen, which was big, unwieldy. It had to be hauled around by a half-track, and experience would show that it could not deploy quickly, and if a position was overrun, it was going to prove to be a sitting duck.
Okay, well, that's our break point now. As I go back, Rouse 773, send me a message on my Facebook page. He wants to know if we can help dig up what happened to his great uncle, who was in the 776th and ended up with his TD in the bottom of a lake in Austria. So he's looking for a little help on that one.
Yeah.
Go on.
I kind of think I might actually have once seen something about them losing one in a lake. Yeah. Well, maybe. It's been a long time since I looked at these records, but I believe that a record exists about them losing a tank destroyer in the lake.
Okay, so Rob can hattle me on that one on Facebook afterwards. Are there any pictures of the supplemental armor that the M10s were designed to be fitted with?
No, yes. That's well, I've never seen it in action. Have you seen it?
Not on the American side. The British used it and the French used it. And there are some monument tanks that actually still have it fitted as a monument.
Huh.
But in the U.S. service, I've only ever seen test reports. I've never seen them fitted to American ones.
Yeah, I mean, what American soldiers did was use sandbags because it was easy. I mean, tank battalions would actually cut up like destroyed half tracks or whatever else they could find, and mount additional steel when they could do it. But I never saw that on a tank destroyer either.
That's actually a fair point. Did the diesel-powered M10 cause any issues in the supply chain with the majority of U.S. force using gasoline at the time? It's true. I did some digging. The only thing I could come up with that was using diesel were some of the tank transporters, the Diamond, was it 980 or something like that? And a couple of the Mack trucks were diesel. But I think the M10 was the only diesel in the U.S. Army.
So whenever you were close to the water, you were in good shape because the Navy had diesel. And the one time I saw fuel type make a difference, in at least as reflected in the records, was actually positive. That when Third Army ran out of gas as it entered Alsace-Lorraine, the tank destroyers were still able to get diesel fuel for some reason. Maybe it was captured from the Germans or something. But the tank destroyers had fuel when nobody else did.
All right. So something that the audience may not know, you speak very good German and you have dug in the German archives. So here's an interesting question. We've seen how the Germans responded to the arrival of the Grant and the Sherman. Did they say anything about the M10s?
I do not recall seeing anything. And yes, I mean, I have seen, in fact, during research on the book I'm writing now, I found a report from Rommel to OKW asking for more 88 millimeter anti-aircraft guns to deal with the American tanks. So that they did come as a rude shock to the Germans with the 75 millimeter gun. But no, I've never seen any comment in particular on the M10 showing up.
Okay, so a couple of other notes as I was kind of going through the book that I wrote down just for the sake of mentioning. So that was the first time that we see mention of tank destroyer units being attached to British formations. And it seems to have happened quite a lot, that the TDs are being sent to the British. And you don't hear about it so much with tank units or anything else, only the TDs.
I would have to say that's correct. At least in North Africa. In Italy, you see the tank destroyers seconded to the British. But often, if something is seconded to, say, the French or the Brazilians, in Italy, it's going to be a tank battalion. And I don't know why that is. Maybe the British had the logistic chain to sustain the diesel engines or something. Yeah, I don't know why that is.
First example, you have a bunch of Americans shooting up and completely destroying a TD company, American Air Power.
Yes.
So starting a good tradition there.
Yeah. Well, I looked into air-ground cooperation in North Africa, and it was essentially non-existent. Someday I'd like to write a book on close air support. The rules of engagement, according to a report from an Army observer in North Africa who'd been sent out from the States to interview people about various things, was that the rules of engagement for American pilots was if you cannot positively identify a vehicle formation as American, attack it. And yes, seriously. And yeah, an entire company of tank destroyers was destroyed by American P-38s. And you find that kind of friendly fire incident is very common in North Africa. It's very common in Sicily, too. By the time that the Allies landed in Italy, they were getting a better handle on communications between ground forces and air forces. And as you're doubtless aware, by the time of the landings in France, the integration is so tight that an individual tank commander can call in an airstrike in an armored division. So things got better and better.
So as you go on to Sartir, you have an M3 destroyed 4 Panzer IIIs with 4 rounds, which for sort of an ersatz tank destroyer isn't so bad. And he's back again. But I see that a few times. You want a good mood. I see that a few times listed throughout the book. It's this TD killed 5 Panthers with 6 shots, or this TD killed. It's like 1 round, 1 kill, which is, if you look into the records, even for the Germans, this is actually very, very rare. But it seems to happen often enough.
I was impressed by the work you did on the Anzio battle. Well, it probably makes a great deal of difference what you're shooting at, right? A Panzer III isn't so tough. A Panther is tough. So, the enemy gets tougher and tougher as the war goes on.
Yeah.
And in North Africa, a majority of the tanks that they're facing are Panzer IIIs.
You have a list. One of the kills is at over 3,000 yards, which isn't bad.
So it was that the kill in North Africa?
Yes. And he said it was actually measured afterwards.
Yes, that was a veteran account, by the way, and the Edson was the sergeant's name, and he got up and straddled the gun and did a dead reckoning shot, and it was an Italian M13, so it was it didn't have much armor, and according to him, the round landed right on the engine compartment. So weird, luck, odd things happen in war.
So you mentioned that the TD units were kind of well rounded because they had the recon unit, they had their engineer platoon. They also had a surprising amount of anti-aircraft capabilities as well. And I think this is the German propaganda shooting itself in the foot. So after the fall of France, you have the video reels coming from Germany. Yeah, we have destroyed the French with our Panzers and our Stukas. Mm-hmm. And the Americans are there going, okay, they're bringing Panzers and Stukas, so we need to bring TDs and anti-aircraft.
That's true, and the anti-aircraft gun is a 50 caliber, whereas on a tank it's just a 30 caliber. So it was pretty heavy-duty stuff. In the records, you do not see the crews using the anti-aircraft gun against airplanes. In North Africa, the airplanes were often their own. So
you have a couple of references to Spitfires getting shot down.
Yeah, you do see occasional references to that happening, Spitfires being shot down. However, what happens in the European theater is, because the tank destroyers wind up having to act as essentially assault guns. They have to behave like M4 medium tanks and infantry support. They have no machine guns facing forward, and you see battalions. It starts with a trickle and then becomes generalized, cutting the machine gun mount off the back of the turret and putting it on the front. And in fact, later there's a great picture of I think it's an M36 with the anti-aircraft machine gun mounted on the front and a homebrew periscope that they've also welded on the front of the turret, because that's what they were doing. It was close infantry support, and it was lethal to look over the top of your turret.
First tank destroyer group lands in North Africa. Talk about the TD groups.
Well, the TD groups ultimately didn't matter at all. What the Army eventually did with them, in North Africa, it was essentially an administrative unit that got battalions ready to send into Tunisia. So it had no operational capability at all. And at least in the European theater, most corps, if there was a TD group, they simply made the TD group the corps anti-tank staff. And the only example of a supra battalion level tank destroyer entity being used in combat was in Brittany, when a tank destroyer brigade ran the northernmost column advancing west across Brittany to Brest. But that was, again, a fluke. Odd things happen in war.
You mentioned Friedendall very quickly. Is there a worse reputed officer in U.S. service?
Well, let's see. Since Omar Bradley said he was personally lacking in courage, probably not. Well, Benedict Arnold, right?
Well, okay, I guess. Well, at least the British thought he was competent.
Right. Yeah, he had some fans.
Yeah. There was something I was reading, not in your book. It was another unit report about the M10s when they first showed up in North Africa. There was an infantry unit under fire, and all of a sudden, big tanks with big guns, start appearing behind them, and they figure, oh crap, we're in trouble now.
Mm-hmm.
Until they show up, stop next to them, and start shooting at the Germans.
Uh-huh.
So that was the first introduction to the M10. So the AAR kind of says, in future, when you introduce new tank destroyers, please let us know about it.
Yes. Well,
that
was also a problem for the M18 because it had road wheels that looked kind of like German tank road wheels, and it had a gun with a muzzle brake. So a lot of infantry were inclined to view the M18 as a panzer.
Yeah.
And they didn't do a good job of familiarization.
Okay, so just a quick, if you're looking in the chat, there's comments about how you can get a couple of copies of the infantry's armor that we're giving away, because that will be the subject of the next discussion next month. Did the Americans ever use an armored track AAA mount besides the M16? Yeah, there was the one with the 37 or the 40 with 250 cals, whatever that one is called, I can't recall. As a Canadian, we have Canadian audience.
Okay.
According to the Canadians, Benedict Arnold was a patriot.
Okay.
Do you feel that the idea of come above the best, come back to us on that one a little bit towards the end? Oh, the M15 was a twin mount, 50 cal. Okay, so when tank battalions were reassigned from self-propelled to towed, or vice versa, how was it actually done? Was it did they bring new people in? Did they just deliver the equipment in the manuals? How would you because the manual covered both. The same manual covered both.
Well, in the case of units in theater, they would just be given new equipment. But I think most of that happened stateside because only a single towed tank battalion was delivered to the Italian theater. So almost all of the towed battalions would have been converted in the States or in the UK. And it would have just been the same personnel retooling to different equipment.
Okay, well, let's move on back to the slideshow. Let's move on to Italy.
Okay. Next slide, please. Oh, all right. Well, what that slide said was that, So the story of tank destroyers in Italy is that the terrain is awful, with two notable exceptions, where there was a lot of tank destroyer action, and those were the beachheads at Salerno and Anzio. But once off the beaches and into the mountains, the U.S. Army was road-bound in mountains. And the only part of the tank destroyer battalions that were super active were the reconnaissance companies, which were extremely helpful to the infantry. Where tank destroyers were used, I mean, we'll get back to the beachheads, but in general, where tank destroyers were used at the spearhead itself, it would have been a small number firing at bunkers or anti-tank guns or something like that. The Germans, for their part, used tanks in Italy in little packets, 2 or 3, probably no more than a platoon at any given time. So it was again a war that bore no resemblance whatsoever to doctrine. And the other main takeaway from the Italian campaign is that this is where the tank destroyer battalions proved their worth as field artillery. A lot of the tank destroyer units came out of the artillery. The unit designations, by the way, start with a 6 for battalions that came out of infantry divisions. So the 645th, for example, came out of the 45th Infantry Division. The 7 series came out of Armored Division, so the 701st came out of the 1st Armored Division, and the 8 series came out of the Field Artillery. But it turned out that the 3-inch high explosive round had about the same blast radius as a 105 millimeter howitzer shell, but it caused a lot less damage to a road surface. So they learned that if you were going to advance over one of the few roads in Italy, it was best not to shell it to pieces. So the tank destroyers could play a role there. They also, everyone in the tank destroyer battalion essentially was trained to direct artillery fire. So you could have a tank destroyer recon man out on a mountaintop call in his battalion's artillery on a target. So they were very flexible that way. The beachheads. So Salerno was a case where the doctrines sort of worked by accident, I'd say. The Germans struck back at the landings there with with an entirely armored force. They eventually had 6 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier battalions attacking the Allied beachhead. It was an Anglo-American landing, 2 separate sub-beachheads. And the tank destroyers were parceled out in company-sized lots by and large. You didn't have a battalion in reserve that rushed anywhere. But the perimeter was so small that you pretty much had tank destroyers almost everywhere. So it kind of worked out okay. The German attacks almost drove that beachhead off. And the deepest penetration was within a mile of the sand itself. And that was stopped by field artillery firing over open sights. So it was touch and go. The lesson that the Germans took away from that had nothing to do with tank destroyers. What you see them talk about after Salerno is Allied naval gunfire and how destructive it is to armored units. And you shouldn't have armored forces anywhere near a place that the Navy can drop cruiser or battleship fire on you. The Anzio case is more
Next
interesting.
slide.
I'm sorry?
Next slide.
Oh, yeah, okay. So here we have a picture of an M10 with ammo stacked on the back heading forward. I'm not sure that was a really great idea, but I guess you had to get it up there somehow. Anzio, again, the Germans knew that it was highly likely the Allies were going to do an end around of the Gustav line and land somewhere. So when the Allies came ashore at Anzio, they had pre-scripted, very detailed contingency plans of exactly which units were going to move to contain the beachhead. And they were helped because the American commander of 5th Corps, General Lucas, didn't think he had enough force to push off the beachhead into the mountains and cut the main German supply line to the Gustav line. So he just hunkered down and gave them plenty of time to surround his beachhead and come after him. February 44 saw a weeks-long series of heavy German armored attacks on the beachhead, most directed at the Americans. And it was a small space, so you didn't have tank destroyers in reserve. But it was a case where, in the case of the 645th Tank Destroyer Battalion, you had an entire battalion available to deal with the Germans. And they were using their brand new Panthers and Tiger tanks as part of the assault force. So this was, the Allies had faced a few Tigers in North Africa, but this was the first time they were encountering them in any great numbers. And what's fascinating, given later debate in Europe about the ineffectiveness of the 3-inch gun against heavy German armor, is that the tank destroyers proved very effective. And I commend to you a series of articles that the Chieftain did on the fighting at Anzio, because it shows that the tank destroyer crews did exactly what they'd been taught to do and took on these much more dangerous German armored vehicles as often as they could from the flank. And they were able to kill them with large volumes of ammunition. But nonetheless, despite exaggerated claims of how many Tigers they knocked out and so on, they killed a lot of German tanks. And it was because the weather was horrible, the Germans were road-bound, they knew exactly where the enemy was going to go, and they could pre-position their tank destroyers to take advantage of it. Once the Allies land in France, they discover that, I suppose they already knew this in Italy, somebody should have told the guys up in the UK, but the 3-inch gun would not penetrate the front armor of a Panther, forget a Tiger tank. And the problem was that it was the Americans attacking Germans who were in positions where they could set up the ambush and get the better field of fire and so on. It was very hard to maneuver and get that flank shot. Siri keeps coming on. I apologize. I'll bury Siri under something so she can't hear me anymore. Anyway, read the Chieftain's articles. It's a tremendous read. Next slide. What have we got here in Italy? Ah, yes. Well, so the M18 first shows up. Oh, yeah. Here's our video.
Tank destroyer specifically designed to hunt and kill enemy armor. With a top speed of 50 miles per hour, the M18 was the fastest armored fighting vehicle of the war.
They could set it into place a lot faster.
Its maneuverability made it well suited to the hit-and-run tactics of tank killing.
So the M18 was Bruce's dream tank destroyer. And he insisted on this design, got exactly what he wanted. It was, the gun was about the same. 76 millimeter was a 3-inch, but lighter. However, it was half as heavy as the M10 because it had only a half-inch of armor on the front, which was about the same as an M8 armored car. It could go 50 miles an hour. And this was the epitome of his idea of fast-moving tank destroyers, maneuvering all over the place and getting around those attacking panzers and hitting them from the side and everything. The sad fact turned out to be that in all of the after-action reports I read on tank destroyer engagements, in no case did I see a clear-cut situation in which the M18 speed made any difference in a tactical engagement. The speed did make a difference in how the Army could use the tank destroyers. The M18 could run with mechanized cavalry. And as the breakout from France evolved, and then later the race across Germany, the M18 allowed the Army to have heavy firepower up with the otherwise lightly armed mechanized cavalry at the pointy end of the spear. So when they ran into a problem, they had firepower on call instantly to take care of it. Okay, so next slide, please. Yeah, funny thing here. During the advance on Rome, you again see in the after-action reports that the tank destroyers are being employed at the pointy end of the a lot of the columns marching on the city. And in this case, it wasn't so much that they were any faster, it's that the separate tank battalions suffered such heavy casualties during the breakout from Anzio that the infantry said, "Hey, we have no choice. We simply have to use." Hey, I see a cat behind me. We simply have to use the tank destroyers as tanks. So they did. It worked out okay. The Germans had left a few heavy armored vehicles in Rome, and there is a vignette in the book, I think, of tank destroyers destroying a Brummbär, one of those huge assault guns with like 150 millimeter mortar on it or something that had taken a shot at them. Okay, next slide, Pete.
Well, that's it for Italy. So, quick pause. Questions? Somebody wants to know how many cats you have.
This is embarrassing. So, I have engaged in some cat rescue, and we have some failed fosters, as they're called, where you take them in, you're planning to give them up, and then you fall in love with them. So I actually have 6 cats. I have 6. So she's a rescue.
Okay, yeah. What you're talking about, just going into Rome, there wasn't a comment in your book that you quoted one of the tank destroyer commanders going, we completely threw doctrine out the window. It was absolutely nothing in the manual, but frankly, we realized that they had no choice. We had to go along with it.
That's right. Had no choice, and that was the flexibility of the tank destroyer. They could do pretty much whatever they were asked to do.
Ensnitko observes, in your book, you note that a barrier to using the M10 in indirect fire was the lack of a white phosphorus round. Was it ever corrected? I can actually answer that. The answer is no. The 76 white phosphorus smoke didn't enter service until after the war. Something else I'd seen in the documentation was how the TDs were used. It was always as a reinforcing fire. They almost never were given a separate fire mission on their own, and they often relied on the artillery units to do the surveys.
Yes, so they took fire control from the artillery units usually. But again, they could, in fact, respond to a tank destroyer forward observer and delivered their own little mission to wherever.
Yeah, I think you mentioned one example of 2 platoons were up forward and the third one was far behind, providing the artillery support for its own company.
Yes. One thing also to say on the artillery was the 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion was the one towed battalion that was sent to Italy, and it found that even though it had towed guns, which looks more or less like artillery, that it was phenomenally difficult to use them because they couldn't elevate enough in the mountains to fire over them. So it was a laborious task to pre-position their 3-inch guns. They'd have to drag them into position. Pointing up, they'd often have to dig ditches for the trails so they could depress further. And it was a very unhappy, dirty, sweaty experience for that particular battalion.
I believe it. Jacob Clark, didn't the TD branch cook up illumination shells in the field using parts of U.S. Navy star shells during Anzio? You are correct. I thought I'd written that in one of my articles. I may not have, but absolutely, they did take Navy rounds. They realized they were very successful. And then they said something like, give us 10,000 of them.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Was it this week? Okay. Scrolling down. Talking about battleships with 16-inch armor-piercing rounds. I don't think so. Was the M10 ever... Okay, so the M10 used a 3-inch. Was it ever upgraded to the 76? You're thinking about the T-72. No, it never entered service. They figured if you wanted to put a 76 on it, just put an M18 turret instead. And Harry, I'm sure we'll mention the upgrade that was given to the M10. Would you call the M8 howitzer motor carriage a TD? No. I'm scrolling down here, Harry.
Okay.
Why was the U.S. tank destroyer design fixated in turret designs? Because non-turreted vehicles are easier to produce and you can put a larger gun in it.
For ease of seeing the battlefield, which was a big part of the doctrine, and a fully rotating turret can take out a tank 360 degrees. You have to point your fixed vehicle at a tank.
I was reading an assessment, I think it was of Archer self-propelled guns, the British 17-pounder tank destroyers, and they were doing a comparison between that and the M10. It's okay, yeah, the Archer has the advantage of being easier to conceal because it's a turretless vehicle and it's small. But they said one of the problems is because this is basically an ambush weapon, once you spend all this time and effort digging in your tanks and camouflaging them and getting rid of it, if the enemy came down the path you were hoping that they would come down, you were fine. Yeah. But if they came over from that side, if you have a turret on your TD, you're not hosed. But if you have a turretless TD, you are completely hosed. And I'm sure the towed gun people, the towed TDs, had exactly the same problem.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to see in the European theater, that they were frequently overrun because they could neither reposition nor run away.
Actually, I guess it's a good time to just confirm. Not every towed anti-tank gun in the U.S. Army was a tank destroyer.
No. The infantry had the 57mm anti-tank gun.
Nobody ever talks about the anti-tank companies. So it's a case of the anti-tank companies were your token defense that you put up in the hope that you could prevent the breakthrough, but when that failed, then you had TDs.
Well, I hope the infantry didn't look at it that way. But, I mean, I guess the infantry did look at it that way because they delivered constant pressure on tank destroyers to deploy forward. And when the towed units arrived in Normandy, they inevitably deployed forward and had to dig in and had to camouflage because, that, and then they were stuck.
Steve GT26 observes that in the fall, we're ahead of ourselves here, but I'll just mention that in the fall of winter 44 to 45, there are artillery ammunition shortages, hence the use of more TDs in tanks. Now, I remember reading in your book that they were rationing tank destroyer ammunition for a while as well, like nine rounds per TD per day.
That's true. Yep. They had fuel, but no bullets.
Let me scroll down and see. There are actually quite a few questions down here. Well, that's true. The M9 was a turretless TD, but that was also a pretty useless one. The same as the M5, so I don't know what they were thinking with the M5. Why no power traverse in the M10? Would it have been that difficult?
I guess I don't know. I've never seen an actual rationalization for that. I would imagine that the weight was less of the turret. So they thought that the hand crank was going to be just fine. And also, part of the idea for the M10 was that it was going to cost less than the tank.
That's the one I saw.
For example, it also did not have a little Joe generator, which the tank had. And it meant that in order to run their radio, tank destroyer crews had to start the engines at least every day. So that was a problem, like on the Anzio beachhead, that when you fired up diesel engines, it gave away the position of your vehicle, depending on visibility at any given time or the noise. But they had to do that to recharge the batteries.
What was the life expectancy of an M10 crew versus the M4s? Again, this comes up time and time again in your book. It's kind of like, we lost this many vehicles, we lost this many guns, but the actual casualty rates aren't all that high.
No, the tank destroyer casualty rates are remarkably low, and yes, compared to the tank units,
which themselves were actually pretty low as well, compared to what people think.
Compared to the infantry, certainly.
Oh, yeah. You cover, I think, 68% rifleman casualties in 4 different units. Okay, let's move on to Normandy. Somebody asking, was the 57 a better weapon than the 3-inch towed? Different role, I would say.
Yeah, and with the 3-inch towed, at least you could take out the Panzer IV with no problem. And with the 57, I really don't know.
Well, it depended on range, in fairness. Now, TD Branch were looking at the 57 for a while. They realized that it had a higher velocity at short range, but they figured that the heavier 75 would keep the energy over a long distance, and they expected to be shooting over 500 yards, which is why they kept the 75 over the 57. Ed, hey, how are you, Ed? Some of the US TDs had their muzzles or parts of the barrel painted red in order to familiarize US soldiers with them and prevent friendly fire. How common was this, and was it only the M18s? Suspect only the M18s, but
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, so that's an interesting little factoid. But the M18 is, yeah, that makes sense because it looked like a German tank.
And yet when the Germans decide to paint up their Panthers as American TDs, they decide to make them look like M10s and not M18s. I suspect it's because of the shape of the turret. The M18 is round.
I guess, or who knows? It was an artistic decision.
Okay, let's back to the slideshow and let's move into Normandy.
So Normandy is a doctrinal disaster across the board for the U.S. Army. They knew full well that they were going into the bocage, but you can sort of understand why. All the training conducted in the UK revolved around getting ashore. And when they ran exercises, at most they'd go into a day, 2 days, maybe 3 days after. They never, ever exercised or put together a plan for how you fight in the Normandy bocage, which is just astounding, considering that the terrain there is like no other place in Europe, I guess. So, you know, the problems the TDs had, everybody had, poor fields of fire. The Germans, like in Italy, generally on the American front, which was in the thick of the bocage, used tanks in very limited numbers, a few at a time. Often it was a self-propelled gun, an assault gun that would be supporting the infantry. The British had a whole different war on their front. They faced most of the German armor. And yet you had these tank destroyers with very useful guns, and the infantry was going to use them. So they took on that role of assault gun, again, doing infantry support. The bocage is interesting to me because it's one of those places where you see the doctrinal difference between the training of the separate tank battalions and the tank destroyer guys. In the bocage, there are many little vignettes you see of individual destroyer commanders or a platoon commander or whatever going out and scouting a route on foot to move his tank destroyer in position to engage an enemy tank. That aggressive spirit comes through at the very tactical level, which is fascinating. And as I mentioned, they realized that the 3-inch or 76 millimeter gun wasn't very useful against a Panther from the front. There was one action in Normandy at Le Désert when the Panzerlehr division staged an attack that just happened to hit the seam between two U.S. infantry regiments and got a ways into the Allied backfield, so to speak. And it was sort of a mini tank destroyer doctrinal display because there were tank destroyers available. They were more or less in reserve, and they maneuvered to engage the Panzerlehr spearhead and took on Panthers from the flank and drove that attack back. So at least, you know, I guess those guys felt that, hey, that stuff we learned back at Camp Hood, we got to use. Next slide, please.
Well, just before you move on,
Sure.
just a quick comment on the Cullen cutters. Steve Zaloga was doing some assessing on the Cullen cutter because somebody mentioned it in the chat there. Thank God for Cullen. And Zaloga's position, as I recall, is that the effect of the Cullen cutter was overstated, and the real winner of the bocage was the dozer blade on the Sherman.
Well, I mean, Steve is the god of American armor. So I wouldn't ever dispute anything he says. The tank dozer was available immediately, and the tank dozer certainly had a more enduring impact on the war in the bocage because it was used frequently. And the Cullen device was held as a secret until the Operation Cobra, the breakout on the 24th of July. So, you know, its use had a very limited window of time. But I have seen in after-action reports comments that the hedgerow cutters gave tankers the mobility of being in an open field. So, you know, it probably depended a lot on where a particular tank unit was and how useful it was.
All right, let's move on then to Cobra.
Right. So Cobra, the big breakout that German senior military commanders after the war said was when they knew the war in the West was lost. It takes place in July. It's really First Army that breaks the crust of German resistance. And when Patton takes command of Third Army on August 1st, the front line is already ripped open. But he is a genius at exploiting it. And for the tank destroyers, as I mentioned earlier, this is where the M18 really shines. Because in Brittany, the M18 was able to run with the spearheads. There weren't that many M18 units at this point in the European theater. But as during the race across Germany, there were a lot more. And so you'd see the same thing with M18s accompanying the point. Next slide, please. So a large German counterattack took place in August at Mortain. And this was their last gasp attempt to close the gap at Avranches that Patton was running his army through. 4 panzer divisions, none of them at full strength, tried to close that hole. And again, they were attacking muscular American infantry divisions. There was only one TD unit involved, the 823rd TD Battalion, which was towed guns. And it was one of those very sad stories that ultimately doomed the towed gun as a concept. Though the Battle of the Bulge was the one that drove the spike into the coffin. But the battalion lost a lot of its guns being overrun because it simply couldn't move or run away. Major tank battles in Alsace-Lorraine was the next big clash with armor. You had enough armor engaged on both sides that for the Americans at least, it was probably the largest tank battle taken collectively in the European theater. The counteroffensive ultimately had, the 21st Panzer Division, the 11th Panzer Division, and 3 new Panzer brigades that were designed for the Eastern Front, but sent west because of the breakout. And that picture back from the doctrine of guys on the hill and tanks running in front of them in profile, that's exactly what happened to the 113th Panzer Brigade. They wandered in front of the 704th Tank Battalion, arrayed along high ground, and for some reason turned parallel to the high ground, and the tank destroyers pretty much annihilated the Panzer Brigade.
I think they were trying to engage the Shermans.
They weren't under attack by Shermans, I don't believe, but they were probably looking for the Shermans.
One moment while I kiss my son goodnight.
Okay. Next slide, please.
Say goodnight, Daddy. Good night, Daddy.
So the breakout ends, of course, by late September. For reasons of logistics and German rallying of defense, the logistic chain was simply overstretched. The armies had advanced far, far faster than planners had anticipated. And the Germans had managed to scrape together from fortress battalions and machine gun battalions and just all sorts of odds and ends enough of a force to man the West Wall, which was in terrible shape, but because they hadn't done anything to it since the late 1930s. But they set to work making it a lethal barrier again, and were very good at that. So the army went from running to trying to break through fortified lines most places. Down in Alsace, they were not up against the Siegfried line yet, but the German defenses were in the Vosges Mountains, which was just about as good. And so the TD went back to its role as an assault gun. And for the first time, that picture on the upper right is a tank destroyer in Aachen. For the first time, the tank destroyer crews have to engage in urban combat. And there are two interesting little things about this. One is they had open top turrets, so it was much more dangerous for them than a tank crew because a German sniper could sit up on an upper floor and ping the guys in the turret. But the other thing was that tank destroyer crews actually received urban warfare training in addition to the commando training they got. So for them, it wasn't quite the alien environment it was for everybody they were fighting with. The M36 started arriving. Now, the M36 had a new turret on an M10 chassis, and it had a 90 millimeter gun. And the Army had asked the European theater, "Hey, we've got these better tank destroyers. Do you want them?" This was early during the campaign in France, and the ETO said, "Nah, we don't need those things." But once the Panther crisis reared its ugly head, all of a sudden the field force wanted that 90 millimeter gun. The 90 millimeter was not the be-all, end-all solution. It still couldn't kill like the King Tiger from the front. And even with the Panther, field tests showed that you had to get within about 500 yards of the Panther to penetrate the front armor. And 500 yards is pretty close. Next slide, please. I like this. This shows the 90 millimeter sort of in action. There's a live Jagdtiger, so to speak, in the upper picture, and there's one that was hit by a 90 millimeter round fired by the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Next slide, please. So, Battle of the Bulge, the last big armor fight that the U.S. Army had. And again, you know, in theory, this should have been perfect, right? A lot of German tanks rolling towards American lines. Tank destroyer battalions will surge to the breakthrough. And that kind of happened. But the only tank destroyer battalions with the divisions in the Ardennes were towed guns. And this was where the weakness of the towed gun proved so obvious that the Army decided they were more of a threat to the troops than they were to the Germans. And after the Bulge, the Army ordered all towed gun battalions to convert to self-propelled. But self-propelled battalions from north and south did, in fact, converge on the German penetration. And they got there fast enough, particularly M18 units. I don't know whether that was geography or just that they were so speedy. Turned up in time to play important roles in the delaying action at Saint-Vit and holding at Bastogne. Two of the actions that just threw the German timetable completely out of sync, and also at the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherat, which was the supposed to be the main thrust by 6th SS Panzer Army, where the tank destroyers and the tank battalion formed the core of the defense in one of the two villages. And I guess it was Sepp Dietrich who, after the battle, was asked why 6th Panzer Army was stopped there. And he said, tank destroyers. So, I mean, at least that suggested that that enemy combatant knew what they were and knew that they'd caused them a lot of trouble. So tank destroyers were credited with 500 kills during the Battle of the Bulge. Who knows whether that's true or not, but that was the story. Next slide, please.
Let's pause there for a second,
Okay.
because the next ones are kind of like concluding slides. So let's a couple of other notes that I picked up as I was going through the book again recently. And this is a little off topic, but you do mention in the Europe chapters, you mentioned that there were 6 TD battalions that ended up in the Pacific. But you don't cover them in the book. What did they do?
I did not. My reasoning was that, I mean, I took a look at them, but they didn't ever fight tanks, for starters. And I figured the tank destroyer story is the story of destroying tanks, right? Okay. They never fought in battalion size. They were essentially assault guns, and so it didn't seem worth investing the amount of time to cover a story that wasn't going to be all that interesting to the reader.
Who was your target audience when you wrote this out of interest? Enthusiasts? Because you have a very easygoing writing style. It's not an academic writing style per se.
Well, I fear that my writing reflects the fact that I was a government analyst for 34 years. I mean, I try to break out of that mold, but anyway, popular military history is different from academic military history in that, as one editor explained to me, you need to have blood. So it's and I feel this actually. I really do feel it, that the interesting part of popular military history is the people who fought the battle and what their experience was. I try to look at everything I write through the eyes of the combatant, not as a detached observer, which is why I like so much to have veterans accounts, first-person accounts. Tell the story for me. I just, like you did with the manual, you just copy it down and let them tell the story. So, I guess I didn't think of a target audience per se. The first book on tanks had done okay, so obviously there was a market for it. The two books were similar in that when I investigated the separate tank battalions, I realized nobody had ever written a book about them. So why shouldn't I? And then again with tank destroyers, nobody had ever written a book about them. So I did. And some people were watching this, because by the time I got around to the book on the mechanized cavalry, Steeds of Steel, like 3 other books came out right about the same time on the mechanized cavalry. So,
well, back to the tank killers. A couple of other minor notes. So, there was a Tiger that may be knocked out by a caliber 50, which started a fire, but there's sort of, I don't know if you've encountered this as well, but there are people that will look at the paper statistics of something and says that this gun is rated for this many millimeters of armor. That tank has that much armor. Therefore, gun A cannot kill tank B.
Right.
And they're shooting absolutely everything. You got one example of a HE round fired by a TD against a Panther that was driving at it. It was a HE round. It shattered the driver's periscope. The driver could no longer see, and it careened into a building and died.
Sure, yeah. Odd things happen in war. Yeah, statistics don't tell you everything. Stuff happens. Stuff happens. You see incredible stories all the time.
You see a lot of people firing HE at tanks.
Yes, you do. Well, yeah. I mean, I've read 2 things. One is that HE stood a better chance of cracking a track than armor piercing. I don't know if that's true. You were in armor, but I have read that. And the second is that that concussion might hurt the crew or disorient the crew. Or if you get a lucky shot and you've hit it already with an AP round, that might be just enough to crack through.
I've seen a couple of references that TD crews were saying, yeah, we hit it, we knocked it out with AP, but then we fired HE at it until it burned.
Yeah.
And I'm not quite sure how that works because you still have the armor, but I don't know, maybe fuel tanks had leaked. Or
yeah, right.
813th TDB, you mentioned specifically, refused to move to the M18.
Yes. I don't know how they got away with that. I mean, it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that the Army's going to tolerate. But, yeah. I mean, think about it. The M18 has as much protection for your crew as a light armored car. And at least with your M10, you have more armor than that, and you can put some sandbags on top. And maybe that Panzerfaust isn't going to get through your final drive into the crew compartment. But who wants to get in a paper thin armored vehicle?
Yeah, there were quite a few comments I've seen on that nature. I think it also depends a little bit on what sort of fighting you're at. If you're in Patton's units and you're doing all this high-speed mobile stuff, you don't care so much about the amount of armor you have. But if you're up in First Army, which is doing all the slugging, then you want something that's, I think one report called it a superb $40,000 foxhole. So the 90 millimeter, you say, okay, yeah, the ETO refused the 90. I don't know if you've seen it. I have the minutes of the meeting where General Barnes was informed about the existence of the 90 millimeter tank destroyer program in the T-53, and he basically blew a gasket.
He was angry?
Oh, he was furious. Not Barnes, I'm sorry, Bruce.
Oh, Bruce.
Bruce was furious.
Okay. Well, that would take away the power of the tank destroyer, right?
Well, I mean, the T-53 was a tank destroyer. It was a 90 millimeter tank destroyer that Barnes had said, we need 90. And Bruce was fuming because, no, this is going to distract from my speedy 76 millimeter. I want to get into the field.
All right.
But the other thing is that I have a couple of documents from 5th Army back in March. And it basically said, stop sending us 3-inch guns, send us 90s.
Yes.
So somehow that communication never made it to the ETO guys, and I don't know to this day why that happened.
Well, I think that the Army did a horrible job of communicating lessons learned in Italy to the forces training in the UK, because a lot of the problems that tankers faced in Italy, they faced again in Normandy, and they had figured things out. Like, for example, they would in Italy, it was routine for tank destroyer battalions and tank battalions to cross attach, so that you had real anti-tank power plus all the machine guns of the tanks and the 75 millimeters, excellent high explosive round, all in a package, and all working together with the infantry. Working with the infantry was probably a little less complicated as a rule in Italy because the field of action was generally pretty small. Whereas in Europe, there was a large battlefield, and talking to the infantry was really quite difficult. And there, the lessons were not shared back. So in the European theater, the first thing they start doing to improve communication with the tanks and the infantry is they install field telephones on the tanks. So the rifleman can go up to the back of the tank, have armor protection, and talk to the commander of the tank. They don't do that to tank destroyer units in the ETO. I found, I think, only one battalion where that happened, like in November or something, or maybe a few battalions. But it wasn't generalized. Then they gave the tanks infantry-capable radios, SCR 300, so they could talk directly with the radio. That didn't happen at all in Italy. And you have to wonder, why weren't these theaters talking to each other about things that they were learning in battle and better ways to fight.
Speaking of Italy, I could have sworn I read it in one of your books. I can't find it in Tank Killers, and I can't find it in Infantry's Armor. But there was an example you gave, I think, of a tank destroyer unit teaching a tank unit how to fight tanks, and then the tank unit saying, we got much better.
Oh, well, that is actually in the Tank Killers. That anecdote comes from the action at Bastogne. The 10th Armored Division had tanks there, and the comment from the I can't remember whether it was a battalion commander or combat command or something, was that that the tank destroyer men gave his tankers a real lesson in gunnery, that they were much better at hitting targets at long range than his tankers were, and that he had the tank destroyer gunners train his gunners up to be better at what they were doing.
So a couple of other points in the book for the audience. If you haven't gotten there yet, watch out for the Falaise Gap, 776 and 607, picking off large numbers of vehicles with only one or two guns. And we're talking stupid numbers, like this one gun knocks out 8 Panthers, things like that.
They were meat on a table, trying to run away.
Well, that's true. But hey, you still get them. And there was another one I noticed was after Aracore, air power being used to flush out targets. So they'd set up where somebody was, they thought some of the enemy were, the airplanes would come down, the Germans would move, and then the TDs would kill them.
Pretty smart, right? And tank battalions started using artillery spotter planes to help with the advance. And you see occasionally tank destroyer battalions doing the same thing. You can put a spotter up and call in artillery support on even a single vehicle. And once you're so dominant on the battlefield that you can pull stunts like that.
Coming back to the chat, James Cameron, some TDs appear in photos with overhead covers on the turrets, but most don't seem to have it. Was it typically an army level modification as far as approval? No.
Battalion level. That was always a field fix by the battalion in the field, and I would say that I found records of only maybe 3 or 4 battalions that did that. Maybe it was more generalized. You don't see it in pictures. And the battalions, I think they were all in Italy at say the Anzio beachhead, where you're under siege and under artillery fire all the time. So you're not going anywhere. You have the luxury of handcrafting steel roof for your turret.
You said you had one unit created them, but they were discardable. So once you moved, you jettisoned the things.
Yep.
In my book, I do have ordnance branch photos of they had roofs developed for the M18, the M10, and the M36. But I think as far as ordnance went, only the M36B2 was an official ordnance approved roof that was in service.
Oh.
Let's see what else we got. Was the US 3-inch originally AA gun? Yes, I believe it was. Was it a Navy gun?
Navy.
Yeah. How many M36B1s were used? 176 or something? Those are the ones with the Sherman hull.
Yeah, I have no idea. I don't remember.
Were the assault tank projects regarding the Siegfried line one-off designs or associated with TDs in any way? The Jumbo or I guess eventually T-28 was developed for the Siegfried line. They weren't TD related.
Not to my knowledge. Bruce would have hated those even more.
I once asked my uncle, who had been a gunner in an M10, if it was hard to deal with snipers. His answer, nah, we just put a couple of shells into the building and that would be that.
Yeah. Well, in fact, you do see often the TDs being used as sniper weapons to take out artillery observation posts and church towers. That kind
and 155 millimeter self-propelled artillery pieces being used as sniper rifles.
In Aachen, right.
Ryan Herman, how much did the operations research analysts, or the the American equivalents, I guess, and their reports have on the evolution of TDs technologically in doctrine? Because you had mentioned in the book that, and I think I have it on one of my articles as well. In North Africa, Devers went over and a few other folks went over, and they came back and they said TDs are not a good idea. Yet we continue to use them for the next 4 years.
Yes. And Patton said after North Africa as well that TDs weren't a good idea. He refused to have any TD units involved in the invasion of Sicily. But then, during the Battle of the Bulge, he wanted as many TD units as he could get his hands on. So, different circumstances. But he was pretty consistent after the Bulge in arguing that they were a bad idea. And
so doctrinal evolution. So the tank armored force only ever had that one manual put out in 1942. TD branch reissued FM 18-5 twice. Or reissued it once. It had the original issue, and then in 1944 it had a reissue with a few changes. One was so aggressive, and the other was that you can use this to shoot at bunkers, I think.
Okay. Well, also, doctrine more or less officially approved the role of artillery. So TD battalions in the UK received the equipment they needed, sighting circles and whatever else is involved. And in their spare time, they practiced doing indirect fire.
Hang on a second and see what else we got. So was the 90mm better than the 3-inch?
Yes.
If you're shooting at something that needs something bigger than a 3-inch, yes.
Yes.
So basically the Army's position was if you can get something by higher velocity instead of a bigger round, they would do that, because if you have bigger rounds, that means you carry much less ammunition.
Well, also, you had the same thing with the M4 series. They didn't want the 76mm model, and a lot of it was complex logistics consideration. That you were adding a whole nother thing that you had to ship from America, ship to the continent, and send out to units. And tank units often wound up with a mix of 76 and 75mm guns. So, that has to have complicated their logistic and maintenance issues too. Yeah. So it wasn't wholly irrational.
Yeah, it must have been. Anyway, was there a doctrine developed for the tank destroyer branch to use in the Pacific theater? I think you answered that already. No.
Yeah, not to my knowledge.
In 1944, T-71 is called Blackjack, and then it is recorded as Slugger. Why the name changes? Now, Ordnance Branch came up with nicknames to be used in PR circles, and originally, yes, Blackjack was going to be the name of the M36, but they changed it in November 44 to become General Jackson. So Slugger, I think Zaloga said it was just the case that it was a colloquial term for a large, heavy-hitting tank. Not a name.
I do, by the way, find references to Sherman's in after-action reports, even though alleged that was not an official name for the U.S. Army for the M4.
I'm pretty sure it's in that document in November 44. It's kind of like it says General Sherman with an asterisk. It says this name is already in common use. Did tanks and tank destroyers ever cross-attach? Well, I think you mentioned that, but yes, they did sometimes.
Yes, they did. And it was much rarer in the European theater. There were, you find, especially in the Siegfried line fighting, cases where there were, for just a day or something, you'd get cross-attachments. In Italy, the cross-attachments were enduring.
So I've made this argument in the past as well. Did the TD doctrine ever really go away? So if you look at a modern attack helicopter battalion, it's very rapid, goes around from A to B, it's not got much resiliency, and it's really hard hitting against tanks.
It's true. But, other things have changed on the battlefield. So your rifleman can fire a tow missile, or whatever at a tank. So you have tank destroyers in the hands of the infantry. And it's much more than a bazooka. I mean, it really works.
Hey, B-Ted, how are you? Good to see you on here. Oh, by the way, I should mention that the Ed that showed up earlier, he's in the UK right now. He's the guy who runs the Armoured Archives YouTube channel. Yes, Jacob, I agree with you. The MGS is not a TD. Okay, so I think that quite at the end of the book it says that TDs had about 6% monthly losses. What caused this low casualty rate compared to the tank battalions?
Well, tank battalions were always infantry support, and tank destroyer battalions played that dangerous role when necessary. So, as a percentage of time, probably your tank battalion was in very close proximity to the enemy more often than the tank destroyers were.
I think that's fair. On the open TD roof, was there a tarp? Yes, there was. There was a lot of chat all of a sudden that came up, so I'm scrolling down trying to find more comments. What's your favorite TD?
Whoa. Well, I like the M10 because it was not glamorous. It didn't have the big gun. It wasn't fast, but it did the job. It's the moral equivalent of the M4 Sherman. It wasn't a great tank, but it did the job.
Yeah.
And that's why, I really love the separate tank battalions. To me, they're the blue collar of the armor world in World War II. They got their hands dirty on the shop floor.
Ed, did the documents states that TD should be named after ferocious animals. Wolverine. The name Wolverine. Where the hell did that come from?
I have no idea. I'm sure Steve said something about it. He talked about names at Think Tank.
He did. That was before I had found that naming document from Ordnance. Now, I have seen a 1946 document from Aberdeen where the word Wolverine is listed after the N10 in ink, pen and ink. Somebody actually pen and inked the word Wolverine after that. That is the oldest reference I've ever seen, and I've never seen it in writing anywhere else. So
all I can say is that nobody in the field called it that.
I can agree with you on that.
That I can see.
Was the M50 Ontos? Well, that's a little bit after the fact. The M50 and the M56 Scorpion self-propelled anti-tank. Any opinions on those things?
I do not. I know nothing about them.
All right. Well, let's go back onto the slideshow then, and we'll go through the closeout.
Put it up. So, the reckoning. Yeah. Well, you already know the end of the story. That tank destroyer battalions were deorganized, but we can at least look at their claims. The most productive battalions, which were invariably in the European theater where they actually had tanks to kill, or a lot of them, claimed more than 100 Panzer kills. An Army study of 39 battalions indicated an average of 34 Panzers. And the kill-loss ratio typically was better than 2-to-1. So, even if you say 50% of claims were not accurate, you still have a ratio of 1-to-1 for more lightly armored vehicles fighting in the attacking role in most cases against very fine German armored equipment. So that is a testament to the skill of the tank destroyer man and the way they learn to fight, the way they learn to go for the flank, the way they learn to use 2 or 3 tank destroyers to take out a single Panther if that's what it took, so that you could get kill shots from different angles. I think we might have one more slide. I'm not sure.
There is.
Next slide, please. Ah, yes. Well, so this we were already talking about this earlier that that the difference between the tank destroyer and the tank was essentially being erased with that M36B1, which was a M36 turret on an M4 Sherman. But of course, the M26 was showing up with a 90 millimeter gun, and so at that point, it has better armor. It has the same gun. Why do you need a tank destroyer? So it is actually kind of interesting that in the Korean War, they found the M26 to be far inferior to the Sherman in the mountainous terrain. And, so, you know, was it a great decision in the end? I'll just leave the question open.
Well, I mean, even the Sherman 76 started to do it as well. So, I mean, the premier TD was the M18 with a 76, and he put exactly the same gun on the M4.
Yeah.
So it kind of goes back. And then the next slide, it just says the end.
But
Jacob,
it's got a tank destroyer photo on it, and that's a cool photo.
It is. So did the crews just call their vehicles by their official designations, such as M4, M10?
Well, what you find, it's they often called them their tank, even though they weren't tanks. I mean, you know, it's got tracks, it's got armor, it's my tank. So yeah, that's what they called it. They didn't say my M10.
Yeah, so my M1 was an M1. I never called it an Abrams, but my Bradley is always the Bradley. It's never an M3. And
well, that's interesting.
And I had been wondering for the life of me. So again, in addition to plugging your book, I'm also going to plug our World of Tanks can openers. And I was wondering where the hell I got the name can openers from, because I knew somewhere I had read, exactly, that was it. I knew somewhere I had read that TDs were referred to as can openers.
It was actually in the tank book, I think. Maybe it was in the Tank Killers. It's in the Tank Killers? Okay. Yeah, it's a quote from radio traffic from the 743rd Tank Battalion.
What happened to all the M18s and M36s after the war?
I have no earthly idea. Probably a lot of them got sent off to Latin American armies and
Yugoslavia,
places like that. Yugoslavia. Yeah, in fact, some of the armor collections have been picking up vehicles like that from former Yugoslav armed forces via the civil wars.
Yeah, the M36s in Korea, I'm pretty sure they were actually Korean Army. I don't think the Americans brought them along.
I do not know. I looked at the tank battalions in Korea. I wanted to write a book about it, and my publisher said nobody will buy a book about tanks in Korea.
Get a new publisher. I know somebody that will try. So a couple of guys saying yes, great conversation. This is going to stay up for a while after we're done on YouTube. In fact, as far as I know, it'll stay up forever on YouTube after we're done. So feel free to link this conversation to anybody else you think may be interested. We'll have a look at the statistics and see if the Cavs Society will do a repeat. I suspect we are, because, as I say, we're giving away copies of the Infantry's Armor, which, surprise, surprise, I also have on my shelf. And we'll Harry, will you come back for that?
You bet.
All right, so we'll come back for that. And I think we are about done here. We went a little bit long. Sorry about that, but I think it was worth it. Cabbage, back to you, or Cabmech. I'm sorry, you changed your name. What? I'm close. Winners for the stuff. Okay, so how are they actually going to obtain their pricing? I don't have it. Oh, hang on.
I hear you.
Oh, here we are. I just. Okay, so we have 4 perfect scores. All. So is this for the book or is this? Oh. First one's for the tanks. Okay, so Zululand 66, JDAD 333, Storm 0545, and Fixriven. That's Papa Hotel X-Ray, Romeo Victor November Mike. There are 16 people that got one missed question. What are they getting? Okay. Tank 34, Rich Sniper, Riptide 109 NA. Hopefully that's not an airplane reference. Vidar 1975, Zepaladin, Aurora Lance, K-Mile 79, ZZ Info, Jeremy Fogelsong, CDLSTL 820, Murdup. Ricky Palacios, good to see you. You got one. That's R. Palacios 2003. Lloyd F. Smith, Kilfee, Foxglove, and Stephen BMX. And the folks who are getting the book in the mail through Amazon are Beefdog123, Feralian, Irks, that's Uniform Romeo X-Ray, Hitter for Life, and Gawky. So they have their, those are the prizes. So as I said, the Amazon guys will go to you. And I guess if we need any more information from you, somebody will let me know or let you know. So I think we are done. Harry, thank you very much for the 2 hours. 2 hours plus all the prep time. So we've actually had Harry online now since like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 in the afternoon. And I guess we'll be back maybe in about a month, give or take, for Infantry's Armor. That should give time for people to read it. And we'll do it again.
All right. Good night.
All right. Good night, all. Take care.